So why is it that I ended that last video kind of abruptly? That's not how this works. It was very definitive and almost against my carte blanche, which is I just can't do absolutes. I'm much more of a middle path kind of guy. But I guess Spirit speaking through me there is like that's not how truth works. Truth is very blunt, and it is not. It's the difference between truth and not truth. But it can be tricky to identify what is your specific truth. So I want to talk really briefly here about the problem of our story. I say really briefly, but I doubt it'll be brief. I'm too wordy for that. So if our story isn't true, if the speaking points that we're talking on all the time are not true, how do we know what is true? Okay, I love this quote by Don Miguel. A lot of this course comes from his teachings in the Four Agreements, which I think is an absolutely incredible book. You should go out and get it. If you haven't read it, you should buy it anyway so you can give it out to your friends, because I think it's one of the most vital texts available to people in the modern world to help us gain control of our power. And he says here, before we were born, a whole society of storytellers was already here on this planet. The storytellers who were here before us taught us how to be human. So what he's talking about here is we're operating on thousands upon thousands of years of old story, of old narrative. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what taught us how to get here. It's what gives us the pride in being human. It's exciting to be a storyteller. It's exciting to be human, to be able to wrap ourselves up in this incredible drama, this play, where we get to define who we are with each breath, with each action, with each behavior, with each subroutine that we're running. It's exciting. But we have to also realize that a lot of what we're operating on didn't even come from us. It came from our ancestors. It came from conditioning that happened time and time again from ancestor to ancestor. This is where ancestral healing comes in. Later on in your healing process, you kind of identify, okay, what ways am I following the same path of suffering that my parents have, or that their parents have, or that other people in our society have had. You look at it from a society standpoint. We keep creating the same amount of suffering generation after generation in each one of our compartmentalized societies, whether you're talking about nations, Western culture, Eastern culture, it doesn't really matter. We're running on the same programs. And it's no wonder that we're living in suffering most of the time. So our story is what's creating this illusion of suffering. We allow it because we attach ourselves to the story of our past. We're not living in the present. We're living on what we know about the past, and we're trying to formulate a best guess about how to operate in the future. Now, how many times have we gone, okay, that really stung, right? Something from our past came up, it really hurt, and so now we want to avoid that at all costs. The ego is a master at this. In fact, it's wonderful at protecting us from incurring the same emotional trauma. But what if I told you there's a better way than just relying on the ego from avoiding situations and really feeling into these situations and see if I can make a conscious decision about my behavior in response to these external events? So I said here, the problem with this method is twofold. It's based on the judgment of our memory, and it takes us outside of our central state of being, where we need to be, where we're actually naturally geared to be. Now, how do I know that we're naturally geared to be in the present? Human beings occupy a very interesting space there when it comes to living in the present. We have a unique gift of being able to analyze our past using memory, and we have a unique way of kind of plotting for the future that a lot of other animals, right, that we look upon in our world today don't necessarily do. They do in some ways, and some have developed and evolved those tricks over time. But many animals live in the present day. They live in this time right now, hoping to survive from moment to moment to moment. So they don't have the same level of energy invested in worrying about the future or overanalyzing the past. This is where we create a tremendous amount of suffering in our lives, is becoming stuck in a mode from the past, or being so crippled by fear over what could happen in the future that we miss the entire point of living, which is right here. Most of life is living present to present. Do you think a tree worries about what's going to happen tomorrow? Absolutely not. What it does worry about is what it's got to do in this moment. How does it act in this moment? And it acts accordingly. It acts like a tree every time. If it doesn't, then there's probably some misalignment, some disease within the tree, and we can see this happen in humans as well. When we act from the past, we're incapable of seeing things as they truly are and accepting them as they are in the moment because we're coloring them with our judgments and our expectations, our assumptions about things that are formed from events in the past. Let's just take memory for an instance. Do you ever have a crystal clear memory of what happened? Absolutely not. Memory doesn't work that way. In fact, there's multiple scientific studies, neural studies, about how memory is very fickle. It's also colored by our judgments, by our perspective, by our worldview. So two people can have a completely different memory about what happened. Therefore, how can we act in a conscious way by judging everything based on past events when we know that what we're judging it on, the piece that we're using as the central point of our philosophy, of our principle, is flawed and usually colored by trapped trauma or irrational emotive behaviors. These sorts of things will only create more suffering because we're acting from a place that's subconscious. Now, the subconscious is amazing. It keeps us alive in many ways. It runs more of our being than our conscious mind does. In fact, you want to give yourself a little bless up for for the subconscious because it's doing so many great things for you. But when we can identify some of these trapped emotions, these trapped traumas, it becomes even more valuable to us. And it prevents us from doing suffering over and over and over again needlessly. The other thing about our story is oftentimes it's not aligned with our true values or our truth. In fact, the things that we value are often given to us by other people, right? We follow along with what our parents or our friend groups value because we want that connection. We want that security of society. That container helps us feel like we belong to something. It's very important for us to have that connection. But how many times have you been in a situation where somebody else is talking about something they value and it just doesn't feel quite right, but you don't voice it and you go along with it anyways and you end up feeling kind of yucky about it? That is a case of living outside of our truth or our core values. So there's hundreds of stories that we accept as valuable that don't align with our core value sets, like being the next TikTok superstar or having a 7-figure business and living like a rock star. These are things that our society deems as absolutely hyper valuable right now. But how many of those people are truly living their 100% best life, not suffering whatsoever, fully living up to their values, fully living in alignment with everything that they want at their core? I'm going to challenge you and I'm going to say not very many. They may appear like it. That's the gift of social media. It makes you appear like you've got all this shit figured out. But I guess I'm just gonna guess out there that many of them are still suffering, and that's okay. That's part of the process. They're still healing. They're still growing. We're all still doing that. So it's not a condemnation of these sort of things, but it is a question we want to bring up and be conscious of. What is it that we value? See, deep down, we all know exactly what we value. We all know what it is. In fact, most of the time, we fall into these things of what we value. What activities, what hobbies do we really value? Is that something that we value? Is work something that we value? Is spending time with our family and our loved ones something that we value? Getting really clear about what those values are can really help you act within alignment of your core and avoid suffering, because when you do that, when you act in alignment with your values, with the core essence of your being, you can't make a lot of missteps. You're not going to be making misstep after misstep. In fact, you're going to course correct, and it's just going to get easier and easier to act appropriately and act in a way that brings fulfillment instead of suffering. Then, what comes about is a need for self-reflection, of pure awareness, so that we can get really clear about what our story is. Without that self-reflection, we run the risk of being told what to do, being told who we are. And instead of just acting on what external influences are bringing into our life, we can take a step back, okay? We can say, okay, is that true? Is this particularly true about me? Is this where I want to live? Is this what I want to do? How do I want to spend my precious energy and time here on planet Earth? Who's the viewer of this narrative that we've accepted as our life? Is it the person, the identity that we've become, or is there something deeper? And this is where, again, presence, meditation comes in at helping us to identify exactly where it is that we've accepted something as true or not, and whether or not we want to accept the quest to rewrite our own story. It comes down to protection and vulnerability, really, or freedom and security. And these next two slides are very similar, but I'm going to go through them nevertheless. What we've accepted as story is comfortable. We know it, and so we know the lay of the land. So we feel as though it's probably the best guess. But at the same time, there's the illusion that we have the freedom within that model to do whatever we want. That's not necessarily true. You see, being vulnerable is a place of power. Being protected, putting up walls, putting up fortifications is not a place of power. It doesn't scream power. It screams insecurity. It screams distrust of the connectedness. It screams separateness. All of these things we talked about before that create unnecessary suffering. When we're putting up walls, we're putting up boundaries, we're talking about taking this toxic person out and this toxic person out, and we're just going to basically sequester ourselves within the boundaries of these little label boxes that we've created for ourselves, which the self-help community absolutely loves. We're acting from a place of insecurity, not a place of power. This is not how you gain power, is through sequestering and putting up walls and boundaries forever. Boundaries are efficient and very usable from time to time to stop like an energetic waste that's happening. Sometimes you do have to eliminate a toxic person from your life, and a boundary can be very good for that. But eventually those walls have to come back down, and we have to be vulnerable in order to be free. And it comes down to the number one question you have to ask in your life: security versus freedom. Which do you want? You can't have both. They don't operate on the same wavelength. This is a choice that we wake up with every morning. Do we want to be free to make our choices, or do we want to be secure in what we've already built? Security means we're not growing, means we're staying in a state of stagnation. Freedom gives us the ability to move around, to choose, to be more free with our actions. Now, this choice is going to define your life. Security is not a bad choice. In fact, sometimes we need those moments where we're saying, nope, growth's not good for me right now, and that's okay. But it's all about choosing these things instead of just operating on a pre-programmed subroutine. Do I want to live with the freedom that affords me the ability to build my wildest dream life, right? Or, do I want to live a life of peace, presence, and true power? That's the choice we have to come up with. And that's the number one choice that helps us dissolve the narrative, the problem-making story narrative that creates suffering in our life.